From almost the very beginning of the story of One Piece, we've wondered whether Luffy's journey is truly his dream or his fate. And now that we know that he has the powers of Sun God Nika, whose fruit has apparently avoided the government for the last 800 years, I think we need to start asking ourselves what's really going on here. And Whoop Slap is far from the only one to bring this up, because Yamato even mentioned how there are as many pirates as there are stars in the sky, but Luffy was somehow the one to meet Momonosuke and then agree to come take down Kaido. She could only consider that an act of fate. And she read Oden's journal, which could contain any of the information that they all learned at Laugh Tale, where Oden said that they learned the entire truth of the world that day. And apparently that information even told you stuff about the future, since Oden said that a certain figure would come and save Wano in his stead, and he did tell Toki about the night that was coming in 20 years specifically, and obviously all of these came true. So do these prophecies just hint that everything has essentially been scripted for the last 800 years? I mean, even Shiarly couldn't predict the timing of things quite as accurately as Toki and Oden did, so is Luffy just some type of chosen one character whose entire fate is already laid out at Laugh Tale? Or are all these events truly a series of coincidences? Well, I think it's probably somewhere in between. It's probably fair to say that Oda will do something better than having it be a purely scripted series of events, but these coincidences and prophecies are still very real and do need some type of explanation. And I think the best place to start breaking this down is with the power of inherited will, which has been one of the most consistent themes in the story of One Piece. Whether it's Dr. Hiryuluk, Ace and Sabo, or Luffy and his own Devil Fruit, we have seen many examples of how important will is and how it can even be passed down in the future to those who inherit it. Like Roger once said, these things cannot be stopped. Inherited will, people's dreams, and the ebb and flow of the ages. And the reason he knows that to be true may be because of what they learned when they found the One Piece and learned the entire history of the world that day. And this could also be how Oden knew his predictions would come true as well. But first, I think we should cover one of the most apparent examples of inherited will that we continue to see in the story, and that would be the Devil Fruits. And it's a perfect time to talk about this because Vegapunk just told us in chapter 1069 that fruit powers are born out of a state of desire or hope, as if people who wanted to do X or Y were finally able to, and it's a representation of the many branches of the future of human evolution. But as we know, these fruits can even be reincarnated, and we even learn from the Gorosei that all zone fruits come with their own will. And Road to Laugh Tale told us that a zone fruit's will is how they can imbue them into inanimate objects like Funk Freed and Lassu. And this will can apparently help a fruit like Luffy's avoid the government for 800 years until it was somehow eaten by Luffy during that fateful day at Makino's bar. It's almost as if the fruit chose Luffy on purpose, because if it can avoid the government for that long, it surely could avoid a young child in a bar. But I think it's fair to say that he's oddly a perfect fit, since he was obviously a fun-loving kid who wanted to be free, just as Sun God Nika did. And obviously the fruit picked the right person, since Luffy was even able to awaken it successfully during his fight with Kaido and become Joy Boy, basically just as the prophecy said would happen. It's like the fruit knew that Luffy could fulfill the will or the desire of those who had the powers in the past, being Nika and Joy Boy. And while it seems weird that an inanimate object could do such a thing, keep in mind that we've already seen swords with their own personalities, like Enma and the Cursed Blades. And of course we can't leave out the Mary and the Klabautermann. And whenever objects like Funk Freed or Lassu were given devil fruits, they became sentient on some level, which shows that there is some component to at least the zone fruits that is alive to some degree. And like Papag told us, never underestimate willpower because the whole world runs on it. And perhaps aligning the wills between the fruit and the user is essential to awakening the fruit properly, because in chapter 1069, Shaka told us that zone users usually become absorbed by their awakened powers and their personality becomes controlled. But Kaido said that both your body and your mind have to be able to harness your awakened powers in order to utilize them. And while he may have been thinking about Paramecia fruit specifically, since he assumed that's what Luffy's fruit was during the fight, I think it's fair to say that an element of this is going to exist for all fruits, and zone fruits might even have another layer on top of this due to their will that they all possess. So I think the lesson here is that if zone fruits don't match up with their will, or they don't have a strong enough will to overcome it or something like that, then they can't control their awakening. Potentially like the Jailer Beasts of Impel impelled down who seem to be pretty mindless, and they also didn't have the God Ribbon like Luffy and Lucci do. So maybe if the user of a zone has the wrong will and tries using the fruit's powers at a high level for the wrong reasons, as if they had the wrong desire compared to the fruit's powers, then maybe that's when they lose control like Shaka said. This phenomenon with zones kind of reminds me of Sulong form a little bit, because it seemed to take extensive training to control Sulong properly and not lose control to the instincts of their ancestors, so maybe the fruit takes control in a similar way if the body, mind, and will aren't aligned in a proper way. In the official translation for chapter 1069, Vegapunk theorized that every devil fruit is a possibility for human evolution that someone desired. And since zones involve another type of creature other than a human, maybe they represent a possible branch of evolution for different animals, like in Lucci's case, a leopard. And whether or not that animal ends up with the awareness of a human or just a deranged beast seems to rely on the will of the fruit user. And since we just learned that Lucci successfully awakened his leopard zone, he serves as another great case study for this, because he was shown to be a cold-blooded killer from a very young age, and leopards can be pretty vicious animals and make for great hunters, so I can see how he'd fulfill the will or the desire of the fruit's powers with that type of attitude. Because if this fruit is meant to represent the furthest branches of leopard evolution, for example, then having an intelligent and ruthless killer like Lucci combined with the furthest physical capabilities of leopard evolution is probably right in line with the dream or desire of whoever first created those powers. And maybe these awakenings can't be attained until near death or even past that, because we probably all remember what happened with Luffy right before Gear 5th, and Crocodile even implied in Impel Down that of course an awakened zone user keeps getting up and that they're revived, as if that's a normal thing for them to do. And let's also remember that Lucci was being hunted down by the government over the time skip because he lost to Luffy at Enies Lobby, and we still aren't really sure how he managed to change that situation around into him being promoted all the way from CP9 to CP0, but maybe after the government did finally defeat him, he successfully awakened the fruit and the government changed their tune a little bit because of how rare that was. That would explain how he was able to join CP0 after that, and maybe the same can even be said for Kaku, meaning that we'll get to see an awakened giraffe form soon, which would just be hilarious, let's be honest. And what's really interesting is I think we can date this phenomenon of zones having wills back almost 4,000 years, which is as old as the Alabasta poneglyph crypt in Alubarna, because inside of there we see a giant engraving of a jackal and a hawk, which were said to be the guardian deities of Alabasta. And we know that Pell and Chaka have those exact fruits, and they're the top two people in the Alabasta army. And I think Chaka's dialogue here against Crocodile is really interesting. I am the jackal. I destroy enemies of the royal family. As long as I can breathe, I will fight. And I think that embodies a lot of what the will of zones are all about. And this is probably proof that Chaka's will lines up perfectly with his fruits, meaning he would likely awaken it if he was ever defeated that close to death, which ties into Pell perfectly. While many people, including myself, were a little confused how Pell survived this bomb, maybe it's because he did die, but he awakened in the process since his will is obviously a good fit. Kinda like how Luffy also survived a giant attack. And since the government even loses possession of devil fruit sometimes, it's interesting that these fruits are still here defending Alabasta after almost 4,000 years. Now, whether those deities actually existed back then and the fruits came later on is another topic, but this is just an example of how long wills could have been living on for. And a similar thing exists with Yamato, who is probably the only one among thousands of beast pirates who wanted to protect Wano from Kaido, and she was somehow the one to find the Inu Inu no Mi model Okuchi no Makami, which is the zone fruit for the guardian deity of Wano. I mean, what are the odds that the person who literally calls themselves Odin happens to stumble upon that fruit in Kaido's castle and eats it? And Wano is obviously very, very old, so this again shows that the will or desire phenomenon seems to have been around for a very long time. But something that's very important and honestly a long-standing theory of this channel that I want to prove to you is that zone fruits are not the only type of fruit with a will, and they're definitely not the only kind of fruit that coincidentally ends up with the perfect user. And and one of the best examples for paramecia fruits is my boy Trafalgar D. Water Law, who has the Ope Ope no Mi, and he just happened to be studying to be a doctor from a very young age. Being a doctor definitely allows him to maximize the power of the fruit's abilities, or otherwise known as the will or desire of the fruit. Just like Lucci's fruit probably wants an assassin, and Luffy's fruit wanted a happy-go-lucky person who wants to free people, Law's fruit probably wanted a doctor that would help people, and that's exactly what it got. This also gets extra interesting when you consider he used his expertise to save Luffy after Marineford, and obviously Luffy went on to become Joy Boy. So maybe there's an even deeper plotline going on here when it comes to the fruits seeking people out that can maximize their powers for an overarching good. Then let's also consider Captain Kidd, who has the Magnet fruit and was shown to be a fan of working with metal as a child, which is yet another perfect combination. And both Law and Kidd successfully awaken their fruits, which again backs up the idea that the wills may need to match to awaken properly. Zones may make you lose control to the animal instincts if the wills don't align, but maybe for other types of fruits, the user simply can't awaken without the wills matching properly. Or maybe it's just a matter of how much they understand the full potential of the fruit. Like Law may have needed more medical expertise, or Kidd may have needed to learn more about engineering. And that's why only certain people can awaken them, and why those fruits seek out specific people who might eventually be able to do that. Another great example for wills matching in paramecia fruits is Whitebeard, whose laugh is literally, and he had the Gura Gura no Mi before Blackbeard forcefully took it somehow. But Whitebeard was also the world's strongest man, and having him be able to create earthquakes seems like a perfect fit too. I mean, even Perona is also a great example, because she ate the Horo Horo no Mi, and her laugh is literally, and she's a huge fan of ghosts, which is what she controls. And she can even become one. When Kuma asked her where she'd like to go on vacation, she said that she wants to go to an old castle swimming in malice where she can sing cursed songs. Yet again, this seems like a coincidentally perfect match between the user and the fruit. Or how about Ivankov, who happens to be the leader of the Kamabaka kingdom and can also change people's gender back and forth at will? I mean, that one seems almost a little too perfect. And there are also examples of this for Logia fruits, like Ace. I mean, obviously Sabo taking on Ace's powers is a great physical example of a will being carried forward, but he even implied that Ace was talking to him in some way after he got the fruit. And Blackbeard explicitly said that getting that fruit would be just like having Ace on his crew. And I know this isn't a brand new idea, but are parts of people's souls or something really trapped within the fruit for future users to inherit? Well, we'll get back to that when we talk about Blackbeard toward the end. But another great example of Logia's will is Eneru, because he used his lightning powers to get to the moon, where he ultimately found and revived the Automata, who just so happened to be powered by electricity. Once Enel got up there, we learned that 3 races left the moon at least 1100 years ago, and one of those races were the Birkins, which is what Enel is. Maybe one of those Birkins in the past had the same fruit that Enel did, and they used that to power the Automata and then find or create the resources that they all needed to survive. But whenever that user died, they likely ran out of their power source, and that's why the Automata went dormant and the other 3 races had to leave for the Earth. Until, of course, Enel found that fruit much later on and then made his way back up there. So maybe the lightning fruit was waiting around this whole time, just waiting until there was someone with a will to make it back to the fairy Verth. And some of you might be thinking that this is a hint to the unlimited power source that Vegapunk talked about, and you're kind of right, but I'm taking a slightly different approach in a future video, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss when that one drops. But one of the absolute best examples of the phenomenon of devil fruit wills is Blackbeard. He said he sought out the Yami Yami no Mi from a very young age, and he even went on to kill a crew member to obtain it. And he said explicitly that his fruit chose him. But some of you may be thinking, Dak, if the fruit was really meant for Blackbeard, then why was it okay being eaten by Thatch? Well, that is actually what makes this a perfect example, because I think the dark fruit requires such an evil user to maximize its powers that it almost tested Blackbeard in a way by seeing if he'd go as far to kill his own crew member to obtain the powers. As if the only way to prove Blackbeard's will or desire is evil enough is to show that he will perform the greatest sin a pirate can do in order to get that fruit in his possession. This is a perfect juxtaposition to Luffy and his Gum Gum fruit, who basically refused to be eaten by anyone but him, so it would go to the right person without any any kind of issue like this. And tying this all back to Vegapunk's point about evolution, and how I said Lucci might represent the furthest branch of leopard evolution, for example, I think that same idea might exist for other types of fruits. Like Paramecias might just straight up be the furthest branches of human imagination, which is why the powers are so wacky and random, and that's kind of what Vegapunk was talking about already. And Logias might be the furthest branches of environmental evolution, which for magma or ice or whatever, that would be gaining sentience and reproducing itself endlessly, which is basically what happens when a human eats their fruit. We have to remember that Logia users are their element. It's not that they simply produce it. And this could be an interesting tie to mythical zones, special Paramecias in quote-unquote god fruits. Mythical zones usually have elements of at least 2, if not 3 types of fruits, like how Marco is a bird but can also produce healing flames, or how Yamato is a type of wolf but also produces ice. And a special Paramecias seem to be almost the same kind of thing, but the Paramecia version. And the only example of this that we really have is Katakuri, whose mochi fruit is like a Paramecia but also has the properties of a Logia. Maybe this is hinting that some people can have properties of all 3, like Luffy. Kaido already highlighted for us how his fruit seems to have properties of both a Paramecia and a zone, and from what we can tell so far, Logia awakenings affect their environments permanently, which we haven't seen for Luffy yet, but I do think we visited somewhere that was affected by Luffy's fruit in the past, which is Long Ring Longland, and that's because everyone feels so free on that island that they even stretch out. So maybe we'll come to find out that Luffy's fruit is capable of using properties from all 3 types, and that's what really makes him like a god. And Blackbeard may be chasing the same result, but by cheating the system, of course, which is another perfect way to paint these two as 2 sides of the same coin. And it could maybe even start explaining the status of a god in the world of One Piece, because it would be someone who represents the furthest branches of environmental evolution, human evolution, and imagination to a degree, as well as animal evolution. They truly represent the evolution of everything and consciousness as a whole, and that's what makes them a god. And one final example of devil fruit wills that I want to throw out there is the pair of fruits that belong to Bartolomeo and Mr. 2, being the Bari Bari and the Mane Mane no Mis, because I think they may even have the same powers as the right and left hands of the previous Joy Boy, since the owners of these fruits today are both obviously massive fans of Luffy, and they were fans before really having that much of a reason to, despite Luffy being much closer to them now. And we even saw these fruits present in Wano 20 years ago when Higurashi and Semimaru used those powers to help Orochi take over the country from the Kozukis, which ultimately led to the return of Joy Boy during the fight with Kaido. And that might seem like a stretch, but I talked all about that in more detail in this video, which I'll leave a link for in the description. And I bet there are a lot of other great examples that I didn't include here at all, like Doflamingo, Chopper, Brook, and many others. So leave some comments down below if you have some in mind. But I hope at this point you're convinced that every fruit has some type of will, even if they may not work the exact same way as the will of the zone fruits that we learned about from the Gorosei. But now I want to tie this all back to the idea of fate and how Oden was able to learn such specific truths about the future that Luffy was going to be a part of. I mean, how were they able to learn all of this information just by visiting Laugh Tale and finding the One Piece? Was there a book that they all read, or maybe some other poneglyphs? Did they listen to a tone dial or watch a light transponder snail movie? But most importantly, how was it even able to convey accurate information about the future? All of those options I just listed are possible, but we have to keep in mind that the One Piece also made the Roger Pirates laugh. And while the One Piece itself could be separate from whatever conveyed this immense amount of information that they all learned, I think it's pretty clear that the One Piece is actually the thing that gave them all of that information because of the context of when Roger reacted to the One Piece. After the iconic Roger laugh panel, which is my favorite panel in One Piece by the way, he says, "Oh Joy Boy, I wish I had lived in your era. This is quite a treasure you've left behind, a tale full of laughs." That indicates to me that the treasure itself tells them the tale, or is the tale. And once they learned that tale and probably understood how the One Piece worked, they all laughed so hard that they cried. So whatever the One Piece is, which if you saw my Lafro Tale video, you may see where I'm going with this, it is both something that made the crew laugh, but also enabled the Roger Pirates to learn almost everything about the world, including this tale full of laughs. Just as Oden even said they learned everything about the Ancient Kingdom, the ancient weapons, and even the Void Century. And apparently he even learned exactly who would come to save Wano and when. So how could the Ancient Kingdom have such specific information, even about the future, and convey all of it so quickly to an entire pirate crew, and make them laugh in the process? Well, I think that's where one of the most important devil fruits in the entire story comes in, and it's one that we were just introduced to, which is Vegapunk's Know Me, Know Me, Know Me. And that's because we know that Punk Records is essentially an endless storage of information that even the other Vegapunk clones can hook up to and upload information to. And Vegapunk even went on to say, if only I could let everyone in the world connect to my brain, all of humanity would have access to my knowledge. Then if the population of the world went on to update Punk Records themselves, it'd create a sea of information that'd surpass what my brain can accomplish alone. And we've seen that his brain already allows him and his clones to make pretty accurate predictions about the future and the past, like how Shaka predicted that he'd die today, presumably due to CP0, even before they arrived and made their intentions known, and he even predicted how the Void Century went down, all because of other bits of information that he's added up over time, and now he's basically connecting it all together like us One Piece theorists try to do. And we saw Vegapunk do the same thing with the devil fruits in chapter 1069, and both him and Shaka made sure to say that these are theories, or their best guesses, because they're just assimilating the information that they have in front of them the best way possible, potentially like the Ancient Kingdom did with their prophecies that Oden talked about. And while I do think that Vegapunk and Shaka had some things wrong with their theories, overall this shows that accurate predictions about the future and the past can be made when you have enough information. And Vegapunk also said that if all of humanity hooked up to one brain, it could accomplish even more than his brain does right now. Like maybe it would let him make even more accurate predictions, ones that are almost so certain he wouldn't even need to call it a theory really. Like if everyone had hooked up to the same brain 800 or 900 years ago when the 20 kingdoms began the Void Century, maybe they could even accurately predict when the world would be saved again in the future, and maybe even the exact day that Joy Boy would return and save Wano. That might be how Oden was able to confidently say that even if he dies, a certain figure is coming and they need to welcome him. And the note that he gave Toki may have included extra details that led to her prophecy about the 9 shadows coming in 20 years. And maybe that brain knew that Poseidon will be born again and where, and that there will be a sovereign to lead the ancient weapons at a certain time, or really any of the other oddly perfect predictions that have come true in the story of One Piece. And maybe that amount of information was also what told them how to make the seemingly indestructible poneglyphs, and how to transport them around the world without getting found, and basically everything else they needed to do to preserve their history for the future so that their wills would exist long enough to save the world from the threat of the 20 nations. Maybe that information just told them straight up that you're gonna have to wait 800 years until a certain time, but they went with that plan anyway because it was their only chance. And maybe this sea of information is what Imu was after in the first place. But before I go any further on that idea, just go ahead and check out this video from Parvision after we finish here, because he talks about that idea a lot more in depth. But when it comes to the brain fruit, let's also keep in mind the precedent from earlier that fruits almost always have oddly perfect users because their will or desire match up. And I think we can all agree that Vegapunk's Know Me, Know Me, Know Me is another excellent example of that. Vegapunk was already a natural genius who had a legitimate need for a bigger brain already due to the big goals he had that were unattainable without knowledge beyond the normal human, like giving everyone endless free energy and creating a vast sea of information beyond what he has today, and even heating up Karakuri Island like when he was a kid, but he was unable to. I mean, he even agreed to work for the world government so that he had the funds to continue his research and knowledge despite his apparent moral disagreements with them. Whoever had these powers first, far in the past, likely had very similar desires, and maybe wanted to create the same pool of information that Vegapunk did. And I think it would be fair to say that if this pool of information was created, then passing that information down to people in the future would be essential so that they can access it and learn from the people of the past. What good is building this library of sorts if it just disappears when the user dies? Well, that's where the awakening comes in, and even the One Piece itself. And this may even be the thing that explains how Oden and the Roger Pirates learned the entire truth of the world that day. The entire truth is a lot of information, probably more than you or I could read or watch in a single sitting. So maybe they were all just given a vast sea of information like Vegapunk has dreamt of, as if the One Piece itself is essentially a storage of information that can almost download the tale of everything to everyone, which is apparently a tale full of laughs, because whatever the One Piece looks like and what it tells you, it made the entire Roger Pirate crew laugh. And if you haven't seen my Laughro Tale video, then this will probably come as a shock to you, but just trust me on this. But I think the One Piece is none other than Joy Boy's afro. And I actually gave a ton of evidence for this even before we met Vegapunk, but after meeting him and hearing about his dream, I'm even more certain that the One Piece is an afro, because it is literally a perfect object to store information in like that for people to download later on, since an afro goes on your head and they can even be pretty huge. Plus, it's definitely something that would make people laugh. I can see each Roger Pirate needing to go put the afro on so they can learn the true history, and that's why they all laughed so hard that they cried. I mean, what a funny situation that would be, especially considering it's the final treasure that everyone has looked for 800 years. When we met Gaimon, he was literally a man stuck in a treasure chest with a huge afro, and Gaimon said that he hadn't spoken to anyone in 20 years. Well, you know who else hasn't spoken to anyone in 20 years? The One Piece. And when he was showing us his flashback, we even got to see it as if the memories were playing inside the afro. I wouldn't be surprised if the One Piece treasure is literally a huge afro sitting in a treasure chest that plays memories of the ancient kingdom, much like we see here. And since Punk Records is massive, I could even see the afro being massive, which would make it even funnier. And if the ancient kingdom went through all this trouble to create poneglyphs and share them around the world, I can imagine that having a storage of information like this would be even more important to protect. And that's why it's the most important treasure of all. And another thing to consider is how Roger said that he was too early. Maybe he learned that they literally couldn't do anything because the mechanizations of the world were already in play in such a way that everything would only happen at a different time in the future with a different someone, being Luffy. And since Luffy seems to have the will that awakens the fruit and lets him become Joy Boy, it was probably only Luffy that could pull off everything as they had hoped. It may not be a certain thing that he will, but it may be that he's the only one that has a chance because of how they set things up. And that brings us back into the idea of whether or not Luffy's journey is truly scripted, because what I just described probably makes it seem like it's all simply fate, like Luffy is predestined to do everything we've seen him do and nothing can stop it. But I think that's only half true, because the other half of that is will. And what I mean specifically is the lesson that we learned in the Katakuri fight. Even when Katakuri could see the future already, Luffy was able to change it. And the more that Luffy improved his observation haki, which haki is a form of will basically, the less and less of an advantage that Katakuri had. So you could say that the stronger Luffy's will became, the less that future was predictable. And Vegapunk already told us how his predictions are 100% accurate despite his immense brain power. So I imagine the same can be said in any scenario when you factor in a strong enough will. Like Roger said, inherited will cannot be stopped. But I think we need to take a second and ask ourselves, what is a will? I tend to think of it as a spiritual or a mental thing, but the devil fruits almost show us a physical manifestation of it. So I asked myself, have we had any other physical manifestations of will in the story? And I think we have, and that would be Brook. When Brook died, we saw his soul actually return from the sky and struggle to find his body because of the fog. It wasn't a matter of him getting more lifespan or something like we see when Big Mom takes souls from people, but his actual soul or spirit had to physically come back to his body. And in Fishman Island, he told us that his spirit is only allowed on this plane because of a unique and powerful energy. So his soul or spirit, or maybe even will, is one part of the equation, but there's also a separate energy that enables his soul to be here, and that energy is likely what his fruit gave him, since it obviously let him come back from the grave. And the thing with Brook is that he is literally nothing but bones. I mean, he has an afro too, but other than that, he's just bones. And he makes sure to tell us this all the time. I think it might be fair to say that his bones are only moving because of his will. It's a representation that all you need is will in this world. Again, like Papag said, the whole world runs on willpower. So that cloud of soul or whatever that came back to Brook's body is probably not just his soul, but literally his will. So that means that anytime someone dies, their will is all that's left. And that's right in line with a lot of the big themes we've heard throughout the story of One Piece. And usually that soul or will goes to the underworld, but in the cases of Brook and the devil fruits, there is obviously a lot more at play. When the devil fruits reincarnate, they seem to go to the nearest fruit and transform. And we've also been told that if someone were to eat 2 devil fruits, then the devils would fight inside and they would die. And the whole context from the discussion earlier was that every fruit has some type of will within it that seeks out the right person. So basically, the fruits seem to literally have someone's will within them. And it's probably the will of whoever first imagined or dreamt of these powers, as Vegapunk mentioned. And somehow these wills were physically manifested into different fruits. And once a user eats it and then dies, that will then leaves and finds another fruit to manifest and continue the cycle, kind of like how Brook's soul left and then came back to his body later on. It was like a way to physically ensure that wills would exist in the future. And while we haven't actually seen anyone try to eat 2 devil fruits, other than Blackbeard, sort of, we don't know if they actually die when they eat 2. But since fruits do seem to seek out users that are a good fit, it would make sense that you can't have 2 different fruits' wills within you at the same time, since they'd want to do 2 different things. But now you might be wondering how a user could ever house another will within them at all. If a devil fruit has a will and a person has their own will, that's 2 right there, so obviously that shouldn't work. So how can one person have 2 different wills at the same time? Well, that's why the fruits seek out certain users. Those users probably have the same will already. Luffy has the temperament to be the sun god and to liberate people, so the will of the Nika fruit fits in seamlessly. Same thing with Law being a doctor, or Lucci being an assassin. But now the question is, how does Blackbeard have multiple fruits? We've seen Luffy and Zoro call him they, although many believe that they were just referring to his crew, and Marco said that Blackbeard had a weird body. And since he's a doctor of the Whitebeard pirates, he would probably know that. So how can one man house multiple different wills within him? Well, that might be explained by what happened at Marineford with the tarp that he put over Whitebeard. We saw that Brook had trouble finding his body because of the fog, so whenever the will from Whitebeard or his devil fruit left his body, it probably had a hard time finding its way out since it was pitch black. And since Blackbeard has the darkness fruit, he may even have an extra layer of power in that type of environment. And since he can capture everything, including light, like he has already told us, I imagine he could basically capture that will or soul or whatever before it could make it to another fruit and transform again. If Brook's will had to find his body after his death, then the fruit probably has to do the same exact thing. And I think Blackbeard probably captured it in that in-between state, basically like when Brook's soul was that little cloud thing. And if inanimate objects are given zone fruits because of their will like we saw in Road to Laugh-Tale, then there must be some mechanism to put Paramecia or Logia powers into objects as well. And maybe what Blackbeard did is exactly how, by basically intercepting its will before it gets to another fruit. This reminds me a lot of what happened with Zeus actually. He was halfway between his soul form and the cloud form when Nami got her Climattack near him, and then when Hera chomped down, his soul or whatever was merged into the Climattack, and then boom, his will or soul is in a whole new item. Blackbeard probably just did a very similar thing, but merged the fruit's will into either one of his rings, or maybe he keeps something inside of his body that houses the power for him. I'm sure his will doesn't match well with the Gura Gura, so I think he's cheating the system somehow. Many people have theorized he has multiple personalities or people within him or something, and that's totally possible as well, but I like the idea that he's cheating the system in a more reasonable yet unexpected way, like using his rings or just keeping some type of objects within himself that he can imbue powers into. But I want to finish this video by talking more in depth about whether Luffy's journey is just a matter of fate or not. And when we think of a will, we usually think of it in terms of strength or in terms of their dreams. But their day-to-day personality is also a huge factor. Remember when Luffy surprised Rayleigh by saying that the opponent's personality matters when it comes to defeating them? That plays a role here too, because I think a lot of pirates would be utterly disappointed to find a giant afro on the island that they spent years trying to find, and since Gaimon is Oda's favorite character, I could even see the afro sitting in a treasure chest so it just totally gets ignored amongst all the other treasure that's there. But someone childish like Luffy or Roger would definitely go and put the afro on if they saw it, even if they didn't know that it was the real treasure. And wearing it is probably how the information of the ancient kingdom is given to you, so you have to wear it to know that that's actually the treasure. And since Luffy and Blackbeard are two sides of the same coin, I could see a scenario where Blackbeard Blackbeard gets to Laugh Tale, sees the afro, and doesn't laugh because it isn't what he thought it was, like a reversal of the iconic Roger laugh panel. He may know that it's a giant storage of information or something already somehow, but maybe he doesn't know that it's an afro, so he's disappointed when he sees it because he thinks it's the wrong thing. And because of this attitude, he may just take the other treasure that's there, like the gold or the devil fruits or the technology or whatever else, and leave the island before putting the afro on and learning all the secrets. And I think this could be a perfect example of why having the right will, desire, personality, or whatever you want to call it here is so important, and why Luffy was the one that Nika's fruit specifically sought out. Even if you have the knowledge and power to find Laugh Tale, if you don't have the right kind of childish will to try and put the afro on or see your friends wear it, then you wouldn't get that information that the ancient kingdoms seem to fight so hard to protect. It's a perfect example of how will matters even beyond the context of Haki and devil fruits, how simply being the right type of person can be a major factor. And we've even seen this kind of idea in other instances too, like how Luffy wasn't attracted to Boa like everyone else was because that wasn't something that he did on purpose. That's just how he was as a person. And that's the type of attitude that makes Luffy a perfect fit for Nika's devil fruit and why he was the one to inevitably awaken it and become the sun god. And this is why Blackbeard isn't the one that Roger was waiting for. Even if Teach gets to Laugh Tale, he may not have the will to actually claim the One Piece and use it for its final purpose. And another way to look at this is Luffy is a dreamer, and his biggest dream is to become the Pirate King, or maybe his other dream that we're still waiting to learn about. And that's what makes him a perfect fit for his fruit. And apparently dreams are tied to how devil fruit powers exist in the first place. But Blackbeard, on the other hand, can't even dream because he doesn't sleep. That probably limits his imagination to some degree and might be part of what Luffy means by it depends what the person is like when it comes to fighting them, because we know that these two are going to have a huge battle at some point in the story. And while I'm sure that Blackbeard's lack of sleep also gives him some type of other advantages, like maybe it's the thing that lets him have multiple fruits somehow, or why he can take devil fruit powers away with his current fruit, but it obviously comes with its downsides as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's what gives Luffy the upper hand when they duke it out for the right to become the Pirate King. And something else that Blackbeard doesn't have is someone on his crew that has an afro, except for maybe himself, but he doesn't count. But Luffy has Brook, of course, and even Roger had his own. And funnily enough, their afro looked a lot like Luffy's hair in Gear 5th. And their name was actually Jackson Banner, who oddly has the same initials as Joy Boy. And both of them write their names as just one word. I actually think there's a lot more to say about this guy, since the only time we've ever seen him was at Laugh Tale, but make sure to go check out this video from my friend KevDog that talks a lot more about that. And that's going to be it for this video, guys, but I do want to give a quick shout out to my newest members of the channel, being Dill4975, who really helps keep things running in the background here and on the Discord, as well as XL Beanboy and Nor Ganji. I appreciate you guys, and I thank all of you for watching. Let me know down below if you have anything to add, and maybe even consider checking out one of these other two videos that you should probably already see on the screen. Later.